Buenos noches. That's all the Spanish you're going to get out of me, which is particularly ironic because my wife is Bolivian and is fluent in Spanish, and one of my sons majored in Spanish in college. But unfortunately, I'm a single language guy. A little bit of French, but it's weak. In any case, I'm here tonight to talk to you about a mutual passion of Alex and mine, and that's digital identity, but specifically self-sovereign identity. How many of you have heard that term before, are familiar with it? Okay, so it's starting to get out there. I was one of about 3 years ago, one of the people that were discussing what we were going to call this new kind of identity. And this term self-sovereign was used. I didn't think it would catch on at all. And yet it did. It's become the term that people use to talk about it. And so my goal here tonight is to explain to you why. Why is this term really taken off? First, a little bit of background. I have been working in digital identity and internet identity for longer than I want to admit, 20 years. Okay, pretty much my whole career. I've been involved with a bunch of different standards organizations, and there's a event, Alex has been there, called the Internet Identity Workshop. It's a 3-day event that's all open space, meaning there's no agenda. You come together, about 200 to 250 people, and they create the agenda every day. This has gone on every 6 months for 13 and a half years. That's how big of a problem digital identity is, and I've been to every one of them. Now, I wear a bunch of different hats, and I'm not going to explain all of these. At the company Evernym, I'm what's called Chief Trust Officer. And then at the Sovereign Foundation, I'll explain I'm one of the trustees, and I chair something called the Governance Framework Working Group. I'm going to explain what that's about. And then I work on a bunch of the different standards in this space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. How many folks in this room are really technical? You're developers, or you like to go down deep? Hands? Okay, a handful. And how many of you have never read a line of code? Just kidding on that one. Anyway, I'm not going to go very technical. I'm going to talk about technical things, but if you have technical questions, there are some areas where I go pretty deep. I'm not a developer myself. I work on the protocols and the standards, but we won't go too deep on that. Okay, so first I just want to make sure, I'm going to talk about a few different entities. I want to make sure it's clear. So Evernym, the company I work for, is a commercial vendor of solutions in this new space of self-sovereign identity. We are building up products that we're going to sell to enterprises and governments that want to use this as a new identity tool. And also we serve individuals who want to have self-sovereign identity. Most of the services for individuals we think will be completely free. They might even pay you, right? You might have a way of capturing the value of your identity. But that's what we do as a company. I'm going to talk about sovereign. How many folks have heard about sovereign in this room? Okay. It's a global public utility that we've set up for this purpose of self-sovereign identity. And I'll explain that as we go through this. And then I'm going to talk about Hyperledger and Hyperledger Indy, which is the open source project that Sovereign helped start at the Hyperledger Foundation. How many folks are familiar with the Hyperledger Foundation? Is that, yeah, some? Okay. All right. I just want to make sure those are clear, the differences in those. All right. So self-sovereign identity is quite a story. Most of you have probably seen this cartoon, right? Do you know how long ago that cartoon was published?
20 years?
More than 20 years. 25 years ago, 1993. Surprising fact, it is the most reproduced cartoon in New Yorker history by quite a bit. When we licensed it for a Sovereign Foundation white paper, the person we talked to at New Yorker said more than about a third higher than any other cartoon, this one. It's because it speaks to such a deep problem on the internet, right? I mean, it can be looked at as an advantage. There's actually a Wikipedia page about this cartoon. It's good reading. It talks about, hey, you can be anonymous on the internet, right? You can be a dog. And that's an advantage, but when you actually need to prove your identity about something, it's a disadvantage. And it just speaks to how far the problem goes back. interestingly enough, the Internet Identity Workshop turned around and with permission, created that logo for the workshop. So it's how far around it is. Now, I'm using the term self-sovereign identity, but you also will hear it talked about as blockchain identity, in a very general term, or decentralized identity. All three terms are used, and they pretty much mean the same thing. Okay, there are some companies out there that talk about blockchain identity, and they have somewhat of a different picture, but pretty much folks have converged on what I'm going to talk about tonight.